Okay, I think it's done. Okay, so everyone is here. So let's call the June regular meeting of the Narberth Planning Commission to order. It is 7:05
Oh, you
p.m.
can talk.
Hello? It's 7:05 p.m. on June 7th, and I'll do a quick roll call of the planning commissioners, and then we'll identify who else is here, and then we will get rolling. So I'm just going to go across my screen. Adam Crom, just say here so we know. Okay.
Here.
Did it visually. Okay. Jim Cornwell.
Here.
Dave Brower.
Yeah, here.
Jim Spear.
Here.
Heidi Boys.
Here.
Jen Jajeski Heon.
Here.
And I believe that is the Planning Commission. We have with us tonight, we have Chloe Moore from the Montgomery County Planning Commission. We have Kathleen Ablonaut from the Lower Merion Conservancy. And we have two members of the public attending. Our agenda tonight will be some quick announcements and updates about our development applications. The bulk of our meeting will be spent discussing the historic district ordinance. And then we'll have public comment at the end if there are comment on any other matters. So I'll begin by discussing pending applications. I also say I don't have any minutes yet ready to give you, but I have actually signed up for something called Otter AI, which transcribes the minutes. And so now it's a much easier job to edit them. If anyone would care to volunteer to help take a pass at that, to help move the minutes along better, that would be great. But fortunately, the hard work of listening to the meetings and transcribing them does not have to happen anymore. In terms of pending applications, we have three. We have 3 Elmwood, we have 32 Sabine, we have 146 Marion. Actually, we have 4, and then the 230 Dudley has come back with their final plan. Unfortunately, the borough engineer and the borough zoning officer did not submit their letters of review for 3 Elmwood. We also don't have the Montgomery County Planning Commission letter of review for 3 Elmwood. Because it was applied for late, and we do not have letters of review for 32 Sabine. I believe we have the county's letter, but we don't have the engineer or the zoning officer's letter. So the applicants have agreed to for us to put those off for one meeting to talk about those, and that will have to happen at a special meeting later this month or early in July. So at the end of our meeting, we'll try and pick a date for that special meeting. 146 Marion was scheduled for July in any case, and so I expect that we will talk about that at our meeting on July 12th. Our normal meeting would be July 5th, but because of the July 4th holiday, July 5th is also a holiday, and so we've rescheduled that meeting for July 12th. So that is what our near-term agenda for the review of development applications looks like. Are there any questions about that? About where those stand? Okay. Chloe, would you like to give us a brief update on the subdivision ordinance?
Certainly.
Process?
We circulated a draft of the plan processing and review section, I think it was 2 weeks ago now, at your request. That's still in draft form. There may be a couple more revisions, but the committee working on that is moving on to continuing work on the design section, the saldo, and I expect that will take another couple months to complete that section.
Okay. Do all the planning commissioners remember receiving from me the draft of the subdivision ordinance that relates to the processing of applications? Let me know if you've gotten it or not. I know Jim got it because we've talked about it. Jim Spear, Dave, Heidi, Jen, Adam, did you recall receiving that?
I didn't look at it if I did.
Okay. I had originally thought we could discuss Aldo all at once when we had it all together, but it may make sense to read over Chloe gave us that draft that some of you requested an opportunity to see it, and so they kindly gave us that. It may make sense for us to discuss that part of the work at one of our upcoming meetings. So what I'd like to do is ask all of you to take a look at it and let me know if you feel like we should schedule some time to discuss it now or wait until we get the whole ordinance in here. So that's what I would say about that.
Could you circulate the material again? I'm not sure that I do have it, actually.
Sure, I could do that. I'd be happy to. Okay, are there any other matters anyone on the commission wants to check in on, updates on things? Okay, so let's move on then to the historic district ordinance. So tonight our main agenda item is to review our progress on both the ordinance, the text of the ordinance, and the map. And those, as you recall, are two separate items that we need to review and recommend to council. And after council considers that, council has to advertise these as an ordinance, have a public hearing, and then have a vote on the ordinance. It's not like a zoning ordinance. They don't have to have it advertised for 45 days. I think it's just 30 days. The timing of this is such that after council votes to approve an ordinance, it would then be forwarded on to the state Historic and Museum Commission, which essentially reviews the historic district, the statement of the intent or the statement of significance for the district, the map of the district, and the listing of what properties within the district are contributing to the district and non-contributing. The state has to approve that before the historic district can take effect. That is all. Those are all integral parts of what council has to look at. And in order to have this considered at the next meeting of the commission, the borough would have to submit that information to the state by August 6th. That's the deadline, which means that if the borough wanted to have the commission look at this at its September meeting, the council would have to vote on the ordinance before August 6th, and their only meeting before that, or their meeting before that, is in July, the third Wednesday in July, which I will look up quickly. So there is a path to having this completed and having this submitted to the state for its consideration, but it remains an aggressive one. So the council would look at this at its meeting on the 21st of July, the third Wednesday in July, if I'm correct. So that's sort of the process. So although I put on the agenda ordinance and map, I think we also would want to talk about the kind of statement of significance about the district as well. So let's make sure we tackle that as well. So are there any questions about the process or what we're hoping to do tonight or what happens after this? Is that clear to everyone? Are there any questions? Yes, Jim.
I just want to clarify something, because I think an earlier discussion of this ordinance had council passing the enabling legislation first and then adding the properties into the district. Is this now an all-in-one scenario? It appears to be an all-in-one.
That's what council's requested.
Okay.
We discussed that with the council president a few months ago. He said he would prefer to do this all at once rather than do it in two steps.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. I should note that according to the way the draft ordinance is written, people whose properties are in the historic district and are considered to be contributing would be notified, and then there would be a public meeting at which we would discuss the district, we would discuss the ordinance, and people could comment on it. And depending on how our schedule works, that could be one of our meetings, potentially our meeting in July, or some other meeting that we schedule. So that's another step in the process that would occur between the time council advertises the ordinance and the time that council votes. Okay, so this morning I sent around, this morning or last night, an updated version of the ordinance draft. It was revised, it was posted before the council meeting on our webpage so that everyone, the community, could take a look at it. It was revised slightly in a few small ways in response to the comments we got from council. Council, I think we spent about an hour and a half on this topic at the council workshop meeting. I'm losing track of time. Was that was last Wednesday, I believe, which we reviewed the ordinance. We reviewed different ideas about what the district would encompass, and we reviewed some matters of process. So in terms of the substance of the ordinance, the draft you have has some modifications in it that address I think there's 3 points that council asked us to look at, either at the meeting or there was a subsequent email exchange that Jen had with Council Member Bush suggesting a change. So I'm going to thumb through here. The first change that was made is in response to a comment that council member made about clarifying that the certificate of appropriateness pertains to removing but not replacing things. She wanted to be sure that if somebody wanted to replace an element, that they would not have to go through the process of getting a certificate of appropriateness. And so we added, if the alteration involves the removal and replacement of a feature, in section D5 through D12, so that would only relate to some of the items, not all of them. The alteration shall not require a certificate of appropriateness. And again, this is under the idea that at the moment our code is mostly about the removal of things. It's not about the regulation of the appearance of new things. It's more about the regulation of people removing things from their houses or tearing houses down altogether. So that provision would apply to replacing roof treatments, cornice treatments, porches, porticos, stoops, porch roofs, columns, posts, vertical supports, windows, bay windows, exterior doors, or canopies. So people could replace those without getting a certificate of appropriateness. They could not remove them without getting a certificate of appropriateness. So that's one amendment that was requested by council. That's on page 10. The second amendment, which is in response to council's on page 11, where we just strengthen the language about balancing energy efficiency and sustainability concerns against the other criteria in issuing a certificate of appropriateness. So the addition, it's really just the movement of a section that says, in addition, the Harb and Borough Council shall consider the benefits, the effects of proposed alterations on the energy efficiency of the structure. So that's just one of the criteria that the Harb would consider. The third change, which I don't think I highlighted, is a result of the conversation with between Jen and Council Member Bush. I'm trying to find it now. guidelines for alterations. It's on the same page, page 11. I hope I printed out the right one. Let's see. Oh, on page 11, section F, number 4, guidelines shall take into account affordability and sustainability, so that when the Harb actually does develop guidelines, which for alterations, which would probably just apply to the advisory review, the guidelines should take into account affordability and sustainability. That was a request that Fred made. So those are the changes in the draft since it was submitted to council a week or so ago. And those are in response to the concerns council had. So I guess what I'd like to do is ask anyone on the planning commission, if you have questions, comments, suggestions, concerns that you would like to discuss about this ordinance before we ask for a recommendation. And after the planning commission discusses this, as is my practice, I'll ask the members of the public who are here if they would like to make comments on this particular agenda item as well. But first I'll ask members of the planning commission. You give me comments, questions, concerns, things you'd like to suggest. Heidi?
Yeah, I have a question about the section of taking out replacing those items in, I guess, numbers 5 through 12.
Mm-hmm.
I understand why it's there, because it could be a hardship to replace in kind. However, there still should be some guidelines for replacement, because that's a pretty broad allowance. I mean, you could dramatically change the way a porch looks if you take out masonry columns and replace them with 2x4s, as was suggested by somebody earlier today. I just feel like we need to somehow have, I don't know if it's indicated that they would be required to get some kind of review, whether or not it kicks out the opportunity for a COA. But I think we do need to be cautious.
Would you be agreeable to the notion that while those alterations might not require COA, they'd require the advisory review? At
least, yeah.
And
I don't know how other people feel about this. I'd be curious.
Well, I'm curious, Todd, since I missed the conversation, if the intent was only if they were replacing with something replacing in kind or similar materials, or if it was just any kind of replacement.
Well, I think the nature of the conversation was that it was any kind of replacement.
Okay, thanks for clarifying.
Yeah, this came from the council members. It wasn't, I think, the council members' general concern was asking people to do things which could be an economic hardship. And I don't think the example she gave was a very good one. But I think overall, since the spirit of the ordinance, the way it's evolved, is mostly to look at things that are subtractive rather than additive. I mean, the purpose of it is not to regulate the design of new things. It's to put the brakes on houses being torn down or porches being taken off or turrets or things like that. That her concern was probably a little, I think if you think it through, there aren't going to be many circumstances where not being able to tear something down is going to be an economic hardship. So I don't think what she was concerned about is actually going to come into play very much with what the intent of the code is to begin with. So I didn't think that a significant change to what the intent is really. I think I think they'd be hard pressed to get a building permit to hold a porch up with 2x4s, to be honest with you. I mean, I told her, I said, look, if your porch is falling down, you have to fix it. You have to kind of like, you know, you sort of have to fix it correctly, right? But that was the context of the conversation.
Yeah, I guess the question is really, I mean, if they have to get a COA, if they're removing a porch column, it's still an item that has to be reviewed.
If they remove it, yeah.
They're removing it to replace it, but they're removing it. So I guess it still counts as a review process.
Well, it says if the alteration involves the removal and replacement of a feature, then it would not. So no, that, at least the language that's proposed here, Heidi, would actually say if you're removing something and replacing it, then it would not require a certificate of appropriateness.
You see what I'm saying, though? It kind of reads that if you're removing a porch roof or removing porch columns, they have to be replaced with something.
Right. Well, no, I think they don't have to replace if you're removing the columns and you're removing the roof and you're removing the deck and you're removing the porch.
But that's going to be reviewed. All I'm saying is that's going to be reviewed. And then
Right.
It may be viewed as inappropriate to remove those things.
Right.
So at that point, you can discuss what they would be replaced with if they're falling down and they need to be replaced. It's a fine point, but it's kind of just the language.
I think if you don't say replace in kind, you open the door to argument. If you say replace in kind in relation to a porch column, it's clear that you have to put back the thing that you took out.
Okay.
I don't see the harm in doing that. That simple little word
Get a pen.
speaks volumes.
Yeah, I think the issue was that it's expensive if a masonry column's falling apart, it would be very expensive to put up a new masonry column. And they would like to replace them with wood posts, articulated or not.
Well, then it's a slippery slope from there to a 4x4.
Right.
Pressure treated.
That's what I think too, unless they have.
And you can get those at Home Depot and have the whole job done in the same day. So that has an appeal to some people, and I think we ought to guard against that.
So Jim, is replacing kind adequate for you?
Yes.
Anyone else want to weigh in? And by the way, I'll invite Chloe and Kathleen to join this conversation too, as you've been advising us along the way. And Kathleen, I think you heard that conversation at council, so you understand the context for it too.
Yeah, I would be in agreement with both Heidi and Jim. I think it's unlikely to happen all that often, but as Jim points out, you could wind up, and Heidi says the same thing, with a pretty unsympathetic replacement. So maybe if it's removed and it's not replaced in kind, then it has to be reviewed. I suppose it would have to be reviewed either way, though, because the council would want to know what in kind is. You can't take it for granted.
Sorry. If it's not replaced in kind, it would need a certificate of appropriateness.
Right.
If it's replaced in kind, if you're just replacing what you have, then it does not require that.
Right. Right.
But you really do need review to confirm that what you're replacing is in kind.
Right. Exactly. That could be subjective. Well, masonry, comes as 2-inch thick or full thick built up stone. So is it appropriate to allow 2-inch thick stone?
Peel and stick.
Right.
Well, perhaps that's the role of the review body to determine.
Right.
So
I don't know.
Go ahead, sorry.
No, I was just going to offer that when I worked on a historic preservation ordinance for HAPRO, they wanted to put something in about in-kind replacement, and there's some language that we worked on there about that. I mean, it's impossible to be precise, but I can just read you just a sentence. In the event that replacement of architectural features from the period of historical significance is necessary, the new material should, as closely as possible, match the material being replaced in kind. At a minimum, the composition, design, texture, and other aesthetic qualities shall be sympathetic to and in character with the historic resources. In instances where materials from the period of historical significance are either unavailable or their use is economically infeasible, Council may approve the use of materials which are aesthetically consistent with, blah, blah, blah. That's mostly pretty much it. I don't know. It's not all maybe perfect, but you can put something in there to say what you mean by in-kind replacement.
Is that in the ordinance, Chloe, or is that in guidelines?
That is in the ordinance.
Okay. Because
the ordinance is saying something similar, that if it's in kind, it doesn't require review. And actually, I said council, but the ordinance says zoning officer, who's making the determination of whether it needs to be reviewed or not, which I guess would be the same in HAPRO. It would go to borough staff to decide, okay, does this need to go to the Harb, or does it need to go to advisory review, or can it just go for whatever permits it needs? So that's the decision point, and where the guidance about in kind is most useful, I suppose.
My question is sort of more technicality of in kind. The language is, such that replacing wood post with wood post, but now you have all these materials available that are like wood grain, synthetic composite, and cement board, simulated lap siding, and you have all these simulating materials. I don't know, does that count as in kind, or are we talking specifically more in terms of what the structure is? Because, the way I was thinking of it, and this may be sort of off base, is that if someone says they want to remove a 6x6 post from their front porch and not replace it, either the porch is coming down or they're going to bracket it back to the exterior wall somehow and cantilever, I don't even know what, like a pent roof or something. So in terms of trying to understand the intention of the renovation or the demolition or whatever is being proposed, I'm just curious to know, what the technical definition of replacement in like kind is.
I'll take a stab at that, Jen. And I think that if you're looking at a National Register guidelines, these would be recommendations for the preservation of historic buildings. You'd be looking at real in kind. So you'd be looking to replace a stave column with a wood stave column. Here, I don't think that you're doing that. And I think that the intent of the ordinance is not to prescribe that kind of work. My experience working with local historic districts is that in kind is something that resembles the original feature. So if you have a composite material that resembles something like the wood post that you have there, or the column, that's appropriate. In Lower Merion, which is the municipality that I'm most familiar with, that is an approach that they use pretty frequently. In kind, if you're talking about windows, and I know that we're not in Narberth, but just as an analogy, in kind could be a composite sash that's a divided light with composite materials that could be painted. It's not going to be a vinyl insert. And again, I think your guidelines should be really helpful, I think, in helping your commission and to articulate that and the public to understand that. But at the end of the day, you know, it's the discretion, I think, of the board working with those documents, those guidelines, which have been formulated so that people understand that that's, you know, in kind doesn't necessarily mean original material.
Yeah,
Hey, hang on.
Yeah.
I see Jim Spear is asking to speak.
for that. And I just follow up with
Jen?
one additional,
Jen?
Oh.
I think-
oh, sorry.
I see Jim was asking to speak.
Oh, I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just going to suggest, what if we said in kind or in appearance?
Jim, did you see the language in the chat? Why don't you take a look at that and see what you think? Because I think that's getting at what you just raised. Jen, I'm sorry to cut you off, but Jim was waiting to speak. So what were you going to say, Jen?
I was just going to comment that it does sort of also inform the affordability factor. You know, like right now, the cost of lumber is off the charts, but, you know, composite or synthetic is obviously more, could be more affordable. And so how the economy of materials influences what these replacements can be, I think is also a factor to take into consideration.
Jen, did you see the language in the chat?
Yeah, let me just read this.
The language at the chat, it should be trimmed back a little. It doesn't need to refer to the nomination documentation, I think, but I think it gets us pretty far. Basically, it says,
Yeah.
I'll read it out loud so everyone can hear it if you aren't reading it in the chat. In the event, and I'm going to modify it a little. In the event the replacement of features, the features we're talking about, is necessary, the new material should, as closely as possible, match the material being replaced in kind. At a minimum, the composition, design, texture, and other aesthetic qualities shall be sympathetic to and in character with the resource. In instances where materials, we have to reword this, but where materials from the period of significance are either unavailable or their use is economically infeasible, the zoning officer or the reviewer may approve the use of materials that are aesthetically consistent with, even if not completely duplicative of, the character of the historic resource, subject to the advice of the historical commission. So basically that allows for someone to replace a material with a similar material that has sort of an aesthetic consistency. If that is more economically feasible, or that could even be if it's more environmentally sustainable, or other criteria we have that could be allowed for. So sort of saying our goal is to kind of have things kind of look the same, but if there's materials that are more economically viable or sustainable, or as long as the kind of general appearance and form remain the same, they can be considered. I think that's what that means, right, Chloe? Putting you on the spot.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's the idea there. And, I'm just thinking about, in terms of the ordinance, this sentence that you added about if the alteration involves the removal and replacement of a feature, maybe we just add some of the adjusted language from HAPRO that I put in the chat to that sentence there, just right there.
Yeah. So I guess, how does that sound to folks? Does that capture, okay, Adam's good, Jim's good?
Well, so this is still leaving it at the discretion of the zoning officer, correct? It says may approve the use of materials. It doesn't say, for instance, it doesn't say should approve the use of materials.
Yeah, whoever's doing the reviewing, zoning officer or whoever is doing the initial intake, yeah.
Could I suggest it lean more toward should approve the use of materials? In the event that these materials are unavailable or economically infeasible, it seems like the zoning officer should approve those materials instead of leaving it up to their discretion. Is that an option, or is it?
I don't see a problem. Anyone else see a problem with that?
Term is shall.
Shall.
Okay.
Here we go. We have a code writer in our midst. Okay. Well, that sounds like we've arrived at a good way of addressing this concern that was raised at the council meeting. Thank you, Chloe, for going through your data banks and pulling that out.
You're welcome. Glad it's helpful.
Okay, so are there questions, comments about some of the other modifications I raised or other issues? I see Councilmember Bush joined us. Welcome. Councilmember, I noted that in the draft of the ordinance that the commission is looking at tonight, we have added in a passage about the guidelines that you were discussing with Jen by email about preparing guidelines for, hang on a second, guidelines for alterations to improve the energy efficiency of buildings. So we put that in there. Are there any other comments or questions about the ordinance from anyone on the commission? Sorry, go ahead, Jim.
Okay, yeah, sorry. These are just clarifying questions, I hope. So this has to do with the Harb. I'm looking, I had it a second ago. It said somewhere, it says here the Harb will have regular meetings. I'm wondering if the regular meetings of Harbs will naturally fit into the application timelines, or whether the Harb will in fact have to have special meetings, to fit within the timelines.
Jim, can you tell us what page you're looking at?
I'm sorry, I had it a second ago and I lost it. It's
I know, I have the same problem with this.
Okay, it's for me. It's page 5.
Okay.
It's 4E4. The Harb shall conduct business at regular public meetings or special meetings as needed.
Okay. So, is there a concern there? Because if their workload is such that they need special meetings, and there are provisions in there, I think, where the staff can approve certificates of appropriateness if in certain cases.
Where is that?
The application and review procedures is part 8, which I have on page 12. And it does say that the Harb shall discuss all technically complete applications at a regular or special meeting within 30 calendar days of receiving the application, unless an extension or deferral is agreed to by both the applicant and the Harb. So there could be a situation where the application is received on the day that a regular meeting would be scheduled, or the day before or after, and they couldn't schedule it within 30 days. I mean, within 30 days would not be one of their regular meetings. And we can adjust that. Let me adjust that. Yes, we can adjust that. If we wanted to make that timeline a little longer, like 40 calendar days or something, where they'd be likely to be able to get it within at one of their regular meetings, I think that would be possible to do.
What would happen if the Harb is unable to meet or fails to meet within the required application timeline? Does it revert to an automatic approval of some kind, or does it just, what happens?
It's a good question, Jim. Hold on. Sorry, give me just a second. Yeah, Council's requirement to review is, it only says sort of based on once they receive the Harb's recommendation. So my guess is that if it doesn't get reviewed within the time frame, it would be like deemed approved. So we might want to look at that. We don't want to stretch this process out. unnecessarily, but we want to make it realistic such that the Harb would have time to review it and council
So
then would have time to issue the certificate of appropriateness.
can I make a suggestion about this
Yes.
for everyone? So number one, whether or not we explicitly put in the ordinance that if something is not acted on, it is deemed approved, I will leave that to the solicitor for his determination. I don't think that's an issue. We should ask him about that and express the concern, but I think that's his responsibility to figure out how the borough should handle that. However, understanding Jim's concern, under administrative review, page 14, section X or town A, the council may authorize municipal staff or designated consultants to issue certificates of appropriateness for certain activities or projects enumerated in section 6 of this chapter. That would seem to me to allow, I mean, maybe there's something we can say there that, you know, council can do this one of the reasons council can do this is if the Harb is not able to, you know, to meet or to process applications in a timely way or in an expeditious way, that the council could authorize staff or a consultant to approve the certificates of appropriateness. That might be a suggestion. Chloe, I'm going to ask Chloe and Kathleen if you've seen anything like that, and then anyone, if you think that's something we should consider.
Well, I'll just say one thing about that, which is that the Historic Districts Act does pretty clearly state that the elected officials are the ones that have to ultimately approve or deny the certificate of appropriateness. And this administrative review process is just a way to sort of pre-approve certain really specific, kind of a narrow thing. So if there's a particular type of review request that comes through that has very clear review criteria and council is certain that they're always going to act a certain way, they can authorize in that narrow case specifying what to do, that the zoning officer or other municipal staff or designated consultants can just go ahead and issue it. And the example that I used, I don't think it was in this meeting, but I lose track, is, you know, let's say, you don't even have this in your ordinance, I don't think. Well, here's a bad example. If it's a fence that you know, you have to review the removal or replacement of fences, and council says, look, we don't care about any kind of fence except if it's a wrought iron fence. And in that case, we want it to come to, you know, go to the Harb and come to us if they're going to remove it or make some change. And otherwise that, you know, we want fences to go through this process so we can really check, but anything else, you can just let them do whatever they want. So then they sort of write that out clearly and approve it. And that allows the approval process. It's like pre-approved by council. That makes sense. So this isn't really a catch-all sort of, oh, if we don't have time to get to it, an administrative person of our choosing can do it.
Okay, so I get that. Is it, okay. Would the state enabling law allow for in a different, like if we added a new A, B, C, D, E, if we added a new line there, would the state enabling law allow council to say in the event the Harb cannot act or meet in a timely way, council may designate municipal staff or a consultant to make a recommendation for the C of A, not to issue the C of A, but to make a recommendation for it?
That's a possibility. I mean, I'd want to check on that, but I think that could potentially work, if as long as it still comes to council, which I understand that you're suggesting here.
Yeah, I'm not trying to bypass that.
Right.
That might be a question I think that would be best put into the hands of Corey. I've heard him say from time to time, when I've asked him about administrative review, that a municipality normally has to have something written into their ordinance, and even a list of items that could bypass the Harb, because as Chloe says, you know, the Harb is the body that's designated to review and not an internal board staff member. If you want to do that, then it is something that has to be either, maybe it could be in this ordinance. I suspect it wouldn't be a separate ordinance, but I would defer to him on that before including any of it in the language of this ordinance.
Right. So you're saying, among other things, it's good to have this in the ordinance if you want to do something like this. And two, it would be good to enumerate what specific things council could, delegate's not the exact right word, but designate someone else to make a recommendation on. Like, you might be fine if someone wants to make a recommendation on one thing, but not like on a whole house demolition. They may want the Harb to look at that.
That's my understanding.
Right.
Since the Harb can have a special meeting or a regular meeting, I mean, is this really, I mean, how big is this of a concern? Really?
Are you asking me? Or
What's that?
my only concern is on the calendar, because I know applications have to be acted on within a certain number of days, and if the Harb has to meet within that period of time and can't, then do they? I'm just concerned with what happens to the calendar. Do they gum up the calendar by failing to meet, or can the calendar move forward without action from the Harb?
Adam, what are you?
So,
going to respond?
I mean, it seems to me the Harb is a body that provides recommendations to the legislative body, which is the council. So if the Harb does not provide a recommendation one way or the other, is it okay to just have the applicant have the option of requesting it to go directly to council if the Harb doesn't take up the topic? I mean, it's going to end up at council anyway, and then, you know, it would go to council without a recommendation one way or the other. And, you know, maybe, I guess council could always recommend it, you know, they could defer it, kick it back to the Harb or something. But I personally think it might be okay if the topic went to council without the Harb, if the Harb doesn't meet. Right, if it to Jim's point, if it's a delay, I mean, the applicant is being impacted by that delay. So it could be optional. They could request, you know, to proceed directly to council, or is that not appropriate?
In my opinion, it's not appropriate, but
Yeah, but it's not appropriate to sit on the application and not hear it either, right? So
I agree. There are opportunities for, I think, for subcommittees to help sort of shepherd these decisions along, and then to bring their recommendations to the Harb if everybody can't meet at once. I know that there's precedent for that in other communities. But, you know, here I think that it's, we're walking on really shaky ground, and I would propose to just table this, if you can, until you get more firm guidance from our consultant at the state.
So, because the second, I thought that two issues were being conflated, and the other was an administrative pre-approval process. And I think Chloe was pretty clear that council would need to narrowly define what would be pre-approved, and then staff is authorized to administratively approve it. But it's going to be a relatively narrow set of circumstances that have to be clearly, I guess, articulated in writing.
That wasn't a good analogy that I made.
I agree.
It sounds like the question then, the issue is what kind of relief or what kind of process can an applicant seek if the Harb can't act on the application in a timely way? And that, Kathleen, you're suggesting we just ask Corey what's the best way to deal with that?
I mean, I think if you can without holding this up.
Well, all we'd have to do is ask for the commission to agree that we'll put that on Corey's agenda, and we'll incorporate language that Corey recommends for addressing that issue, that we can't address it tonight, but we'll ask our consultant, we'll ask Chloe, who is our consultant, and we'll ask Corey, who is, you know, representing the field and the practice in the state, to suggest language to put in that we'll fill in and give to council. Jim.
Or could we just flag it for council? I know we want to move this along. Could we flag it for council and get an opinion from the solicitor? Like, is failure for the Harb to act, is that deemed approved?
We'll ask about that anyway. We'll ask the solicitor about that anyway. But I mean, I think what I'd like to do is give council as complete a package as possible so that they can advertise it. And if we can't settle it tonight and we need more advice, then I guess what I'd ask you all is to say, okay, so we'll defer to what Chloe and Corey. I mean, we've had Dave and Heidi looking at this pretty consistently. You could also agree just to let Dave and Heidi and Chloe and Corey, based on Chloe and Corey's advice, figure out what the right approach is, put that in the language. Adam?
So I do agree with that approach, but I do think, but perhaps it might make sense to suggest that, saying something is deemed to be approved would be the last resort option, right? As opposed to any other better. I think it's better, for example, if you have to advance it to council, to advance it without an approval, rather than say it's deemed to be approved, because it hasn't been approved. It's just hasn't been acted on. So.
Well, that's why we need to ask the solicitor. There may be there's underlying issues.
Right. I'm fine with, if that's what's legally required, fine. I'm just saying, it seems to me that would, if there's a better way, follow the better way. So.
Okay. Is that satisfactory to folks? We can't resolve tonight. We'll ask Chloe and Corey. We'll let Dave and Heidi take a look at it, and we'll also check with the solicitor. Generally, my sense is John is not interested in cluttering ordinances up with language like that if he doesn't have to. So that's how we'll address that.
Can I just ask a clarifying question on that? If Corey says, no, you can't write anything in here about council can approve it if the Harb hasn't looked at it, would you want to extend the time frame slightly from something like the Harb shall consider everything within 30 days to 40 days, and same with council, or is that not something that you want to do?
I know that there's all kinds of quirky things that happen with schedules, and things like this month in June or July, we're going to have to meet a week late because of a holiday. So I think 40 days actually just gives a little more administrative breathing room without necessarily dragging the process out. I mean, I'm actually concerned about a lot of these timeframes, to be honest with you. But even like this month shows that because we have to have our meeting a week late, 30 days wouldn't have, if we were reviewing Harb applications, it wouldn't have worked. We would have had to had 37 days. So I think I would think that's a good suggestion. And that's actually one of the things I'll make sure, I asked John about as well. That the just as an ordinance writing procedure, I want to ask him if by putting date timeframes like that in, are we setting, traps that could cause the borough to not be able to enforce the ordinance because it's missing this deadline or that, and so they have a way of dealing with that. Okay, are there other issues? I want this to be discussed thoroughly, but I also want to be mindful of the time, so I want to try and get to the bottom of them quickly. Are there other issues you'd like to talk about or ask about? Okay, so I think tonight if my notes are correct, we've really talked about two things, I think. One is modifying the ordinance with language somewhat based on what Chloe gave us from Hatfield in relationship to the replacement of architectural features with similar materials. And then secondly, we talked about seeking further guidance from Corey and our consultant, Chloe, on how to handle the review procedures in the event that the Harb is not able to meet and review something in a timely way. And if there are no other questions or comments, I guess what I'd like to do is ask if there, from the commission, ask if there are questions or comments from the members of the public who are here tonight. If there are questions.
Todd, may I go first?
Sure, Ira.
So I had one minor concern. I doubt it's a problem, but I'll say it anyway. So you talked a lot about replacing with the same materiality, but I wonder if you'd also have to replace with the same detailing. I've been involved in projects at work where we were sort of required to have the exact same detailing, and it became very expensive to do that because we had to have custom molds built to replicate the existing condition.
Well, the language we were talking about was mostly just about the kinds of materials, not about the detailing. It's a fair question to ask the other commissioners about. I'll note that, the intent of this ordinance is not to micro-regulate the design of things. That's not the spirit of it in any way, shape, or form. But I'll ask, do any commissioners have thoughts about Ira's question?
Yeah, I think that as much as I would personally love to try to control those kind of things, I think the general intent when we undertook this was not to be overly onerous. And I think that starts to go into that territory. So I think we have to be real careful that we don't start to layer that level of control over the process.
Thanks.
I think that the proposed language that Chloe introduced sufficiently addresses that because it talks about more than material. It talks about design, composition, aesthetic qualities. So it goes beyond material. That you should try, that you should make an attempt to create something, replace it with something that's sympathetic to, but again, that it doesn't have to be a replication.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
That's where the advisory group, I think, is really most helpful, where you can sit down in kind of an interactive process with the homeowner and talk about options and what the alternatives are and what the cost implications of those various alternatives would be, and come up collectively with a reasonable, strategy.
Anyone else in the public have any questions, comments? Is that David? Good evening, David.
Hey, how are you, Todd?
Great.
Good. So the question I have is, if you can just walk me through, if today I wanted to replace the front door of my home, what does that look like?
Chloe, Kath, could you walk him through, Chloe? Would that be appropriate to ask you that?
Yes. So ideally, you would first talk to he has a lot of titles. Kevin, your code enforcement officer, or possibly another staff person, a regular staff person, say, this is what I want to do. They can say, okay, are you just repairing it, removing it to repair it and replace it? Or are you going to put something else there? If you say, I'm going to put a new door or a different door, or I'm sealing off that entrance to my house, then well, I guess it depends on which of those. If you're sealing off that entrance, you're taking the doorway entirely, you would then be scheduled for a visit to the Historic Architectural Review Board, who would take a look at your project and ask you about it and make a recommendation as to whether that should be approved or not, whether that's appropriate, make a recommendation as to the issuance of a certificate of appropriateness, and then that would go to council for a final decision. But if you just say, well, I need a new door, I'm just putting a new one there, it's not going to be the same door, it's a new one, then it would follow some of this language. Well, is it Is it similar? Is it a similar material, similar aesthetic quality? And if the borough staff person reviewing it determines yes, then it doesn't need any further review. And if the borough staff person determines no, then it would go to the Historic Architectural Review Board, who take a look at it, and they would make a recommendation as to whether a certificate of appropriateness should be issued or not.
Chloe, looking at the ordinance,
Yes.
I'm not certain that a door would even be reviewed.
It says removing or concealing exterior doors is
So
reviewed.
You're changing out the door. Maybe there's room here for clarification. I think that's an excellent question, and I'm not sure that it's.
Yeah, the
Well,
question I is, so if I want to, I'm thinking of a couple of things we've done to my home here. I'm on Chestnut Avenue.
Mhm.
So if I replace we've replaced windows, we replaced the front door. So if I was replacing looking back now, if I was replacing the front door to our home, we're not sealing it off. We still want to keep a front door.
Yeah.
I
What
don't
is that?
think that's in the ordinance.
What does that look like? And is there, can I just go and replace it, or do I have to actually make an application to replace my front door?
Kathleen, it's the section we were just talking about that says, well, in the draft that we received for this meeting, it says, if the alteration involves the removal and replacement of a feature, the alteration shall not require a certificate of appropriateness. And then we're talking about, well, is that just an in-kind replacement?
But what is the feature that we're actually talking about? Because if you look at the features that are regulated, for example, windows aren't. So I just did a search for door, adding exterior doors. So you're not really adding a door.
No, that's in the advisory review section. I'm looking at the certificate of appropriateness section, which is section 6.
Okay.
I think to what Kathleen's saying, it says removing or concealing a door, exterior door. So that doesn't say replacing the door.
Right. So the highlighted part E that we've been talking about for much of this meeting.
I understand. It's the way it's written. The point being that the previous paragraph D,
right,
item 1 through 12, does not say that replacing a door requires a certificate of appropriateness. If you remove the doorway, I think is what it's trying to say, the opening, that would require a certificate of appropriateness. But simply rehanging a new door, it doesn't seem to me, it doesn't seem like it's required to be reviewed.
I'm really glad that we're having this conversation, because I think it can be interpreted a couple different ways, and is by the people here.
Yeah, I read it the way that you're reading it, Adam, and I think of a door in the same way that I would think of a sash, a window sash. So we're not talking about creating or removing a window or door opening. We're talking about replacing, and it doesn't appear to me, but that it's one of those regulated features. But maybe we could make it more clear.
Agreed. And then also, just to be, like paragraph E, the new paragraph, doesn't add any new requirements for a certificate of appropriateness. It merely exempts replacements from requiring this. So it doesn't add any new burdens. It only takes away burdens from the previous paragraph. So if the previous paragraph doesn't require review of replacing a door, then it's not required. And so maybe it should be written to be clear one way or the other. But I think it personally, it's like the window to Kathleen. I don't think it's that confusing. I don't think a door requires review under this.
No, and it's funny, Adam, section E actually complicates things a little by even introducing the idea of replacement, right?
Well, you could have, there's other ways you could phrase all of this. Like paragraph D could have incorporated the element of E in the paragraph itself, just by moving the idea of replacement in kind to the beginning of the paragraph, saying, replacement in kind, according to all the terms that Chloe identified, that's substantially the same aesthetically, materials and so on, is exempt from a certificate of appropriateness. And if not, if you do these things, then you do need one. And and I think the issue is closing the doorway, the means of egress and ingress, not replacing the panel or the sash.
And would it have to be the same size, or could it be any size? Because I've seen larger doors replaced with smaller front doors, and I've seen it go the other way as well.
Well, then you might be, if you're filling in that opening, then you're changing the opening. So,
Well,
Right,
not
so
Actually, that's pretty clearly dealt with. Changing the size of a step, stairs, or entryways. That would be a advisory review, but not a certificate of appropriateness. Adding doors, adding porches, porticos, stoops, things that are additive or kind of changes like that would just require an advisory review. They would not require you to actually get a certificate of appropriateness.
So in that example of replacing the front door with another front door, there's really no review for that.
Well, you'd have to contact the building code official, but
And do you have to make an application, or you just contact the building code official?
I don't imagine you'd have to make an application unless it was determined that you actually had to get a certificate.
Okay.
Or unless you otherwise needed a building permit for what you would want to do, which
Right.
this
Sure.
ordinance doesn't change anything about that, but
Understood.
Yeah.
Todd, is there a copy of I didn't see it in the meeting notes for the ordinance that was up?
And we will post the ordinance when we finish these modifications, and when I transmit it to council, we'll post it then.
And how about the map? I see on the meeting agenda, there's a map.
Yeah, we will also post that when we transmit it to council. So there's a previous draft of this ordinance that is posted. It was the one we sent to council
Right.
for consideration. And so when we approve these changes and finish these changes, then we'll post the new draft as well.
But the map that you're discussing tonight, can we see that, or?
We'll show it on the screen when we talk about it.
Okay.
Okay, David, does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you.
Any other questions from the public? Okay. So there are no other questions from the public, and planning commissioners have asked questions. Is that a question, Kathleen? Or are you just fixing your camera?
no question.
Would someone like to make a motion in regard to this draft ordinance, a motion for recommendation to council? Don't all jump at once.
I make the motion that we recommended the ordinance to council.
That we recommend and would you agree that we should recommend the approval of this ordinance with the changes that we've discussed and those that will be worked out with Chloe and Corey?
Discussed, which I believe was lengthening the number of days
Mm-hmm.
and reviewing with the solicitor what happens if the Harb doesn't review an application within the drafted period of time.
And with modifications to the language about replacement of certain features?
With Chloe's, yes, substantially similar to the Hatboro
Mhm.
ordinance, not referring to the nomination, the creation of the district, but in terms of achieving the same, similar aesthetic or material qualities to the item being replaced.
Okay. I think those are the things we discussed, right? Okay. Is there a second for that motion? Oh, great.
I second that motion.
I'm going to give it to Heidi, who's worked hard on this. But Jim,
Heidi seconds that motion.
Heidi, there you go. And then, So then I will ask for a vote. All in favor of recommending this to council with the modifications we've discussed tonight, which Adam described, say aye. Raise your hand.
Aye.
Opposed? Very good. We're halfway there. And might have been the short half. So now we will talk about the other half of this. So Kathleen, I actually neglected to contact you today about the statement of, that describes the district. I mean, I guess I'm kind of procedurally wondering how we handle that. Is there something that, or I guess, can you or Chloe give us advice on, since we don't actually have something to look at, that's something I think we need to incorporate in what we pass on to council. So let's talk about the map first, and then we'll circle back to that, because that statement depends on the map. So when council met on Wednesday, council tasked the planning commission with developing a couple of alternatives that they wanted us to bring back to them. They wanted us to look at sort of like a matrix, one map that showed the historic district mapped as if the period of significance for this district were to approximately 1945, and one map that showed the historic district mapped as if the period of significance were to about 1970. And then they also asked us to consider showing a map with downtown included and without downtown included, which we discussed with, not we, Dave and Heidi and Chloe and Kathleen discussed with the state, and we learned that that's really not feasible to create a donut hole in a historic district and exclude buildings like that. And if there were any properties that we felt were not appropriate for inclusion in a historic district, we would have to explain why they would be non-contributing to that district, and use that tool of mapping which buildings are contributing and which buildings are non-contributing, if there were any buildings that we felt should be excluded from the application of the ordinance. So rather than present council with a mapping of 4 maps, including 2 maps with donut holes, I think our goal is to present them with a map of each variation, and with the mapping of which buildings would be contributing and non-contributing in each case. I also think, if nothing else, council has made it clear to me that council would like us to make a recommendation as well, as to which map we feel is the best approach for Narberth. Should the district encompass features and resources throughout the 60s, or should it be limited to features and resources throughout the mid 40s? And so I'm hopeful that we can also vote tonight on which approach we would like to recommend to council in that regard. So I think to start, what I'd like to do is, particularly for the public, is show each map. And I guess, Heidi, if you wouldn't mind explaining the map of the district as proposed, with the area of significance extending through the 60s, and why you think that is the appropriate way of looking at the historic resources of the borough. And I'm not sure, someone else should describe the other map. I don't know, Dave, would you be willing?
Yeah, I'll be happy to.
Dave, you can describe the other map, and at least we'll get that out on the table. And then what I would like to do is ask the planning commissioners to comment on the 2 different approaches, and we'll entertain public comment. I think what we should do is decide on which approach we feel is more appropriate, and then talk about which buildings within that approach are contributing or non-contributing that we would want to not include in the mapping of the district. But at least let's start there. So Chloe, are you able to call the maps up? And could you show us the map that shows the district mapped as if the period of significance extended through 1970? And then Heidi, could you explain to us what we're seeing and why this is why you think this is representative of the district that the borough should be creating.
Hopefully you're seeing a map. North is kind of to your left here, more or less. This map was created through some hard work by Dave, who walked all around the borough, marking properties as contributing or non-contributing, and we worked collectively on figuring out where the boundary would go around the outside with guidance from the state to try to, around the edges, cut out anything we knew wasn't going to be part of the district. Okay, so I'll let Heidi take it from here.
Heidi, you still there?
Sorry. Basically the borough developed over time, and there's continuous development from when the borough first incorporated in 1896 until now, but the bulk of the development was through the 40s and then continued pretty significantly through the 50s and 60s. Chloe shared some numbers with us, and it looked like while there was a lot of development during the 40s, the 30s and 40s, there was probably half again as much during the 50s and 60s, and then it really did slow down. So I feel...
Sorry, I was just going to ask if you wanted me to share that.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind. That'd be great if you have it handy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can just share that for a second since you're talking about it. It was this table of the number of structures built during each decade. And so there were more actually in the 50s and 60s than in the 40s, but quite a few more from 1900 to 1939.
So the bulk of the borough really did develop in the teens and 20s. But what I'm suggesting is that at least through the 60s, the development was pretty continuous in a fashion which was consistently developing larger estate properties into developments of homes of similar style. And through the 40s, that style tended to be what we see in the bulk of Narberth, which is the front porches and the houses with the pitched roofs and sort of traditional, historic, what most people think of as historic properties. But then the development continued in the 50s and 60s as additional large estates were subdivided. And then the style of those homes became more modern, more mid-century modern, if you will, or simpler. And examples of that would be Country Lane and Narwin Lane. And Country Lane, you may or may not know, is brick twins, relatively modest in that area. Country Lane. And then Narwin Lane is split level homes. The idea of being built in cul-de-sacs is not new for Narberth. So it has really nothing to do with not being part of a grid. It really just has more to do with the style of the times. And I see these developments as very critical to the overall look and feel of Narberth. And it's not just homes. I mean, there were developments of commercial built properties too that became more mid-century modern. And you'll see those in the downtown. And some of those may be earlier, but some of those are in this period. And they really do lend themselves to add a more diverse fabric. And also our properties that we don't want to lose to large developments. I mean, especially Narwin Lane. which is the most recent, it's 1961, I believe. We would not want to lose any one of those homes to a developer because they're on good sized lots, and therefore they could be torn down and made into $1.5 million, traditional home amidst this kind of lovely environment of split level homes. And they work together. I don't know how many people have walked down there, but it really is a very pleasant street. And so all I'm saying is that by taking it up to 70, we're actually feeling the borough as it is. We're not feeling the borough as an up through traditional porch, pitched roof village. It is in fact a diverse of style and character that shows itself best by going up to 1970. And I just want to say that also, in addition to that there is a section in our comprehensive plan which says the rationale for the community character is in fact, and I'll read this, I have it in front of me because I wanted to find it to read. It says, many of Narberth's buildings and architectural styles are important for their contributions to the community character and help establish the unique look and feel of the borough. Implementing preservation methods will ensure historic and contributing properties remain part of the fabric of the community. And I don't think we just stop short of those more modern styles of homes and commercial buildings. And one other point, we're only talking 50 years ago. So, I mean, it's still a long time ago. It's still history. I mean, if antiques become antiques at 30 years old, or I'm not sure how old they have to be, but when historic ordinances first came into place in the 60s, they were looking at 1930s buildings. That was 30 years prior. So now, why can't we consider buildings that were built 50 years ago?
Okay. Thank you. And before we leave this map, Chloe, what I'd like to do is ask, is there a way that you can zoom in? I think for the public, it would be good to show them a little more closely the red buildings and explain what they are.
Sure. When we can zoom in, we just lose part of the borough, but
you could also skip around too, right?
There are going to be some buildings within the district that are determined to be non-contributing because the district boundary has to be contiguous. You can't cut anything out of it unless it's at the edge like this. And non-contributing buildings would be buildings that don't fit in with the whatever it is that we end up writing about what is historic here. So if we describe historic buildings as built during a certain time period and having certain types of character, then non-contributing buildings would be ones that don't fit in with that. And as the ordinance is written, there's none of the regulations would apply to non-contributing buildings. So in most cases, the non-contributing buildings here are ones that were built more recently than 1970 or more recently. So that's what these are here, shown in this
I should also mention that in both maps, there's a very limited number of buildings that were included as non-contributing because there was so much exterior alteration to the buildings that they lost their connection with the period that they were built in. Those numbers are very small. I think on these plans, there are only 2 actually that are shown that way. But I just want to mention it so just to make the point that it's not entirely chronological, mostly chronological, but not entirely.
Right, and that this, what's drawn here is not set in stone. If we use the 1969 end date, we could still decide, oh, well, certain of these buildings on Haverford really should be non-contributing because of the degree of alteration or other things. And we can We can discuss every individual building within this boundary if we want to. And
So we'll have that'll be what we tackle after we talk about the general idea of the district.
right.
No.
Yeah.
So Dave, since you jumped in, could we switch to the other map, and could you explain to us what that represents in terms of the historical and what the view of what the significance of the district is, and also what the difference is in terms of what's mapped in the district?
Yeah, so this map represents a cutoff date of the end of World War II. And you can see there's areas of a significant inclusion that were not in the map shown previously, primarily Country Lane and Narwin Lane on the lower portion of the map, but also some other pieces along the perimeter on Haverford Avenue and on Montgomery Avenue that were carved out. And what I guess the philosophy that was central in doing this map was the idea that the significance of the district, of the historic district, was the development of Narberth as a railroad suburb, and that both the phenomenon at the end of World War II marked a definitive ending point of that phenomena. Once, as we all know, there was a huge social change that happened after the war. The expansion of the interstate highway system, the entire automobile culture came in immediately afterwards. And this idea that the historic district and the character, the historic character of Narberth was rooted in things that happened before that date. So that's the philosophy that went behind this map. That's not I'm not trying to make a value judgment of one over the other, but comparing to what Heidi said, it represents two different attitudes about what the historic district should represent. And you will see then, not only in the areas around the perimeter that were eroded away by going from 1970 to 1945, there are significantly more buildings within the district that are marked as non-contributing. Buildings that were in the earlier plan, but not in this plan. For instance, St. Margaret's School.
Could you zoom in a little bit, Chloe, and help us see a little better
Okay, so you see St. Margaret's School. You'll see the modernist 60s, 50s, and 60s commercial buildings on Essex Avenue are now, drawn in as non-contributing, and and you can, sort of, just scan around and see the, of course, the same buildings that were shown on the 1970 plan of being post 1970 are also included in this plan.
I think there's still a couple of Essex Avenue buildings are left out that I think.
I don't claim that this is 100% accurate. I tried real hard, but there were some, I found some contradictory information in the various databases that we were using on dates of construction. I think there's, sometimes there were later building permit dates, so there was a little confusion in my mind in some of them. But the intent was to show, again, this was primarily based on chronology. Anything that was constructed after the end of World War II was considered non-contributing. And then the two examples I mentioned earlier are buildings that actually predated the war, but had such significant changes that they were also marked in.
Okay. So thank you, both of you. What I'd like to do is give every other planning commissioner an opportunity to share their thoughts on these two maps and these two ideas about what our district should entail. I would, again, like to, hopefully we can get to a point where we can make a recommendation to council. We'll present both maps to council, but I'd like to present them with a recommendation. I think it's important to hear from the other planning commissioners first. And like I said, before we vote, we'll also ask if anyone in the public who's here tonight would like to comment as well. So I won't call on names. I'll just look for volunteers to see if anyone would like to jump in with your thoughts about either which of these feels more appropriate, or questions you have, or suggestions you have about how either of these districts might actually work better.
And if you want me to put something back up, anyone, while you're speaking, just let me know.
Any volunteers?
It's a tough one, Todd, but I see the virtues of both arguments. I think the argument about Narberth being particularly an artifact of the railroad era is the one that is more compelling to me. Narberth continues to grow to this very day, some of which we're trying to bring to a speedy halt, but it's undeniable that there has been a continuous development of the town from its earliest days. But the fact that, as the spreadsheet pretty eloquently illustrates, the great majority of it was between the wars, and I think that's the argument that persuades me.
Okay. Would anyone else, like any other planning commissioner, like to weigh in about your thoughts about these two different ideas? Jim, you're smiling.
Yeah, I can see the benefits of either of these, and I think I concur with Jim and Dave mostly that the areas added in the 1969 map, I was trying to I walked down them recently just to remind myself what they were like, and in the context of what we've been talking about in the first half of this meeting, the detail and the items that need a certificate of appropriateness for removal or replacement and all that stuff, they don't tend to be present for me at these areas added, Narwin and Country. So I think those are not. I think I would lean away from including those areas, and I think I would lean toward the 45 map for that reason. However, I'm glad we're sending both maps to council, and I hope we do so with all the comments for their consideration.
Adam or Jen, our newest commissioners, you're being put on the hot seat after it's only your third meeting. Do you have any thoughts, two ideas?
I'll try to cut to the chase. But I will begin by saying that I do tend toward the 45 map because the railroad was central, I believe, to identifying the construction techniques that would come to define the architectural character of Narberth. Narberth not being like on the historical register, but materials were brought in on the train to build, stone houses. Those construction techniques, I believe, define our local vernacular as a practice. And I think the railroad was part of that development insofar as what materials were being used to build. I appreciate the mid-century architecture, but I think it belongs to a different, framework of more of an, I would say more of a national, coming from California, having a more presence as a mid-century style rather than as a local, which is as a district, I believe, seems more in keeping with that character. So I would say 45.
Adam, do you have any comments?
I agree with pretty much everything that's been said tonight. So I think when it comes down to trying to decide between the two maps, I mean, personally, I think the discussion of Narwin Court or Narwin Lane, I'm sorry, it does drive home how sort of exceptional it is as a intact sort of piece unto itself of, I guess, 60s subdivision and architecture. But in some ways, that's what makes it different from the entire rest of the map, because it's an enclave of a one type of development from one era, one pod, probably one developer, I would think. So it's in that sense, it is, although it's definitely part of the community and part of the texture and part of the story of Narberth, it is an exception actually when contrasted with the railroad suburb map, which encompasses most of the main, I guess, the main development of the town. So of the two, I think that the 45 has more of a basis, and that doesn't diminish the architectural significance of say Narwin Lane, but that is of a different, I guess, it's a different story in terms of development narrative. So those are my thoughts.
And I'm last. I would, speaking for myself and not as a chair, I would say I tend to agree with those arguments as well. I know that in a certain sense, the mapping and analysis of historic district isn't meant to be a popularity contest. It's meant to reflect serious study and consideration and interpretation of a cultural landscape. And I do think the two stories, the two landscapes that are being described are very compelling. But I also think that the 1945 narrative somehow feels, while no narrative of this sort is really truly unique. There are many little developments like Narbrook Park all over the country, or at least all over the East and the Midwest. It feels like the railroad narrative is more what is essential to what makes Narberth, and what makes our history and makes us what we are. And that the other areas, while they may reflect a larger story, they do feel to be not so much unique to Narberth. They feel like they're part of a different story that's not too distinguishable from our surroundings in Lower Merion Township. So while I realize that again, it's not just about what's popular and what people like. I do think the 1945 narrative reflects more of what Narberth's unique and specific history is. I will say, I didn't say this at the beginning, but when we conferred with the state preservation officer about this, the feedback was that both narratives would be acceptable. Each has its own value and worth, and would be the basis of a approvable historic district. So I don't think we're, if we choose one or the other, that we're in a position of having running into trouble with the state's approval of this district. So I'd like to I guess what I'd like to do now is, because just mindful of the time, is anyone in the public like to comment on this question that we've been discussing? There's a few people still here. Doesn't look like it. Okay. What I'd like to do is I would like to make a recommendation. I do think we should forward both of these maps to council, but I'd like to make a recommendation to council about which one we feel is the more appropriate one to be mapped as an arborist historic district. So before I ask for a motion, I'll just ask if there's any last comments anyone would like to make, and then I'll ask for someone to make a motion to recommend one or the other of these districts.
I'd like to just make one last comment. Remember, we're voting, or we're suggesting that any building between 1945 and 1970 may be demolished at will. Just, and you know, how will we feel about that 10 years from now, 20 years from now, when properties continue to get developed at scales and in styles that I don't know how many people here like what's been happening with the teardowns and the new construction, but that troubles me. And all we're talking about is a checks and balances to a slightly later period. And the fact that those homes don't have the ornament that we've been focusing on in today's discussion, in that one section of the ordinance about sympathetic to and in character with the historic resource, that's just one small component of the ordinance. We're just talking about extending it an additional 20 years, 25 years. It's insignificant. I mean, we didn't get to touch on what the process is. It's not an onerous process. If you are in an historic district, and if the bulk of people who live in Norworth have to go through the process of being reviewed, why not include a few more? That's all. It's not about railroad town, car community. It's not. Cars were in Norworth in the 20s. You know, so yes, the bulk of Norworth was gridded out in the 20s, but it continued to develop continuously. And I just don't understand why we would quit at 1945.
Any other comments? Thank you. Okay, would someone care to make a motion as to the recommendation we should make to council? I need a volunteer.
I'd like to make a motion that we choose the map that goes to 1970.
Is there a second for that motion? I don't hear a second for that motion. So can someone make a motion to approve the map that goes through 1945? Jim, is there a second for that motion?
I would like to propose that we recommend the map that ends in 1945.
Okay, is there a second?
I'll second that.
Dave, a second. Okay, all in favor of recommending to council that the historic district map include the era that ends in 1945, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
I see 6 ayes, and all opposed to that map. I see 1, that's Heidi. So it's a 6-1. We will recommend to council that the historic district include the era through 1945. We'll present both maps to council for their consideration, but we will send them along with that recommendation. So the last question we have is in the 1945 map. Are there any other buildings that we would like to suggest for whatever reason would be a non-contributing building? I mean, we just, not arbitrarily which one should be non-contributing, but are there buildings that you would like to remove as being non-contributing, and what would the reasons be that you have for those buildings? So can we call that map back up, Chloe? Or do you-
Yeah.
Yeah, and if I could, let me provide a little background, unless Kathleen wants to as a historian, but I'm happy to. The south side of Haverford Avenue in the central business district, from the Station Circle to Narberth Avenue.
Can you zoom in a little, please?
Yeah, can we zoom in there? Okay, so that block that's which was once at the bottom of the sheet is now in the middle of the sheet. Okay, so we're talking about the south side of Narberth Avenue. Really, the block from the American Family Market heading, I guess, east towards the corner at Narberth Avenue. All those structures are pre-1945. So if you use just the chronological cutoff, they should all be considered as contributing. I'm of the personal opinion that there are a couple of those buildings. There's the building at the corner of Narberth and Haverford, and then the third in from that corner, that are two-story brick buildings that date back to the founding of the borough. I don't have the exact dates in my mind, but they're either late 19th or early 20th century, are older than the other buildings, although maybe not by much. But I think more significantly is that they maintain the character of their original construction in a way that the other one-story buildings do not. So the question on the table is, do we retain those buildings as contributing, but the other buildings up to and including the American Family Market, I guess the old A&P store, should be considered non-contributing because they've undergone such dramatic alteration from their original construction. So that's the matter on the table.
Okay, so so you'd like to suggest those buildings be considered non-contributing?
Yes.
Before we dig into those buildings, let me ask, are there any other adjustments to the map that people would like to propose?
I'd like the commission to consider whether the same argument that was just made would apply to the buildings on North Essex Avenue that are west of the bank building, particularly the two-story part of the bank building.
Sorry, Chloe, can you zoom in just a little more?
Yeah, Adam, it's interesting you said that, because today, literally today, as I'm coloring in these maps, I thought about that specifically. And I have I have not colored part of a building in and left the other part uncolored. But that did occur to me.
Well, to the west of the bank, they look more like 1950s buildings, but maybe I think they've just been so heavily modified over the years that
the one that's colored in is the one that is very definitively of that 60s era. The other buildings I was working off of, again, some of the maps that Chloe provided, that color-coded the dates, and they were all shown as being I believe they were shown, pre-war. unless it's entirely possible I made a mistake.
I understand that at least part of the original footprint may be pre-war, but I'm wondering if perhaps there's been heavy facade changes, even
Yes.
even additions onto the buildings, the original structures. That they really don't have any kind of a cohesive architecture that represents pre-war at all, in my opinion. But I don't know.
Can you identify which buildings you're talking about on the map? Put your cursor on it.
Is it possible to do like street view, maybe?
Yeah, it's also probably any of you should be able to circle them if you go to the Zoom controls and click on annotate.
Holy cow.
So Todd, Dave, Adam,
You can have the technology.
we probably have the technology.
Where do you
Unfortunately, any of us over the age of 50 don't have the bandwidth to do it.
Where do you find those, Chloe? Meanwhile, while you teach people how to use Zoom, I'm going to call up Street View, and then I'll be able to share my screen if that is an easier way.
If you have a bar where you have mute and stop video and participants in there, there's a little thing with a pen that says annotate.
I have it on Street View. Can I?
Sure. I'll just stop sharing and you can just share on Street View. That's fine.
How do I do
Well,
that?
while we're switching, I will just read you, because to follow your own ordinance, you have to make sure that you're using your own definition of non-contributing, which says a building that does not add to the association's architectural qualities or values for which a district is significant because it does not relate to the documented significance of the district, or due to alterations, disturbances, additions, or other changes, it no longer conveys the significance of the district. So I think that fits with what you're saying, but just there. Okay.
Can you see mine?
Yes.
Yes.
They were significantly altered.
So and there's the gym, so there, there's a little bit maybe of the 40s, but they're pretty, yeah. And this one is just taxpayer retail, and you can see the 2-story part even behind. So they actually were additions added onto much older structure probably. There's a house back there you can see that has the commercial has been added to it. Again, this storefront may be older than 1945, and then I don't know. I assume this bank building may be part of the original bank.
No, actually, that was an addition. Kathleen, you sent us that great photograph on Friday that showed the original construction that was pre-war, and then this addition was post-war.
So if this is post-war, really, I think everything. I sort of missed what Chloe's definition was. I just wanted it also to hear what people thought, but it seems like this whole block, starting at the ATM here, isn't necessarily contributing, in my opinion. But I don't know. I mean, just a thought.
I can do a little bit more work if you can turn the camera, Todd, back to a little bit to the left of the uppercut gem.
Adam's driving the camera right now.
Oh, Adam, thanks. Where the ATM is, because I think that may be pre-1945. It's not part of the development that was originally associated with that bank building. That's 1926. But this is a colonial revival building, and except for the Citizens Bank ATM in there, it's probably replaced a window. It's got integrity, but I can make a more firm confirmation about the date of that building. And I guess that would include this one with the picture windows. That's been changed a bit, but that parapet looks pre-1945.
Mm-hmm.
See, I mean, you can see this is, I mean, this is, I mean, it is part of the Narberth story, but in terms of an architectural moment, it's the, anyway.
While we're chewing on this, can we, Dave, would you like to look at the other buildings on Haverford Avenue that you were?
Yeah, that's a good idea. Can we get to start at the corner of Haverford and Narberth and work westward? Is that possible? Or is it, oh, well, let's go from this direction since it's easier.
Either way, if you want to go from this direction.
Yeah, we might as well. We're here. Why don't we just walk down the street? And you can see what I'm talking about is, going, well, I said the American Family Market, actually the building to the immediately to the right of it, to the left of the Philosophy, and proceeding eastward. I'm suggesting that those one-story buildings should be non-contributing. And then when we get to the two-story building, to the left of the phone repair place, that building and then the one on the corner, as I mentioned, are two brick buildings, relatively intact, at least in terms of form and if not storefront, and go back to the early days of the borough, and I'm suggesting should be maintained as contributing.
Dave, do you mean the building on both sides of the alley or just on?
No. Well, I'm talking about only the two-story buildings.
Okay. Not
the one-story building.
So I have a slightly different view of that. So I try to struggle with what my criteria are that don't involve alteration, because I think in a commercial district, in a dynamic area, particularly with facades, you're likely to see alterations. And I'm thinking that on this area of Haverford Avenue, I would have a smaller set of buildings that I would consider to be non-contributing. And that is mostly the buildings between the two-story photo studio that's shown in the old photo studio building that's shown there, and roughly, I think, the American Family Market. It's that strip that has the metal band at the top with the signs.
Mm-hmm.
That I would limit my suggestion about non-conforming to those buildings, and the reason is that I think that, first of all, the other buildings like the American Family Market and the building to the west of that, I guess, still have a bit of integrity. I love going behind the American Family Market and looking at the roof.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that and the building next to it have their integrity as small scale commercial buildings. And we recognize that because we actually allow buildings just like that still to be built. But the other building that I'm suggesting is not contributing. The reason why is even though the bays of the storefronts are very narrow and so it has a very kind of walkable, small scale feel, the building is actually very large. In terms of its street dimension, it just happens to be broken up into smaller storefronts. And it's not real. It is an infill taxpayer building. It's not like so it was sort of like a very cheaply constructed. You can even tell the difference in the construction of this versus the construction of some of those other buildings, Dave, like the market and the building next to it. It just has a different quality to it that doesn't feel like it was built to be a real, contributor to a commercial district. And it's because its scale is bigger, it's not really in keeping with the rest of the scale of the building sizes and storefronts. I also feel like another break point is that I think it's more characteristic, though not entirely characteristic, to see two-story buildings downtown. I think there are a lot of one-story buildings, so you can't entirely use that as a rule. But I think that when Narberth was trying to build its downtown, it was trying to build two-story buildings or three-story buildings, a shop, and some place to live above it. That was the idea, and that was the character. And I don't think that strip really embodies that. Though I admit there are other one-story buildings that are quite nice. So I'd reduce my own thoughts about. There's a smaller set of buildings in the south side of Haverford Avenue, I think. I think the American Family Market is sort of a classic little in-town supermarket building, from the roof line to the windows, even to the crazy little colonial eyebrow over it. I feel like from the point of view of kind of, it's kind of a little bigger than the other stores. So it's like a real muscular anchor type building. I really feel it has a lot of integrity. And it's, Essex, I can't quite get my arms around that, what I think about those buildings. I'm having a hard time processing that, Adam, one way or the other.
Well, when the one-story buildings were built, there was an effort to not waste floor area on stairs. Unlike the two-story buildings where somebody lived upstairs, presumably the shopkeeper lived upstairs. But when these little one-story buildings were built, they didn't live anywhere near the stores. So why waste valuable retail space on stairs?
Well, I think too, the assumption, I guess, was that unlike the buildings across the street, there wasn't enough of a market on rental apartments to justify their construction.
Yeah, that may be true too. But even today, downtown, along Chestnut Street, for example, the stairs have all been ripped out.
Yeah.
In order to maximize the retail area of the first floor. I think that's the story here.
Jim, where does that lead you, though, in terms of thinking whether any of these buildings should be considered non-contributing?
I have a very hard time separating my love of the funkiness of Haverford Avenue, the mishmash of it. I find extremely appealing. This is from somebody who grew up in an adorable little colonial village in Connecticut. But the randomness of this street, I think almost everyone in Narberth finds appealing now. Why is that? I can't put my finger on it. I would hate to see any of it lost.
It's classic Alan Jacobs. What you're responding to is how interesting the walk is, because every 15 feet you have a different set of storefronts and a different use, right? I mean, you have a ballet, ballerina, a mannequin, you have the ice cream store, you have the frame shop, which usually puts a little piece of art in there. We have the tacos and the McShays. So it's like you're responding to what a pleasure it is to stroll along the street, and enjoy all those different diversity of activities in a very pedestrian oriented pace.
Well, it's undeniable that should there be a new development on that side of the street, even if it was well designed, and even if it had exactly the same tenants, it wouldn't have that kind of visual interest that this does. I mean, that's undeniable. And this is a building that has absolutely nothing going for it, but it's, to use Jim's term, it's funkiness.
Well, sure. I mean, also there's actually very famous parts of, say, Buenos Aires in Argentina that are like this, where it's very low cost construction, vernacular materials, and the people use paint in particular, right, to punch up the architecture. So that's globally, it's quite common to decorate. This is what is it? Venturi Scott Brown, right? This is the decorated shed. This is a decorated shed. It's what it is. I personally don't think that we can never come up with something like, not every new building has to be a disappointment. There is a way to do something that would also provide delight. But I think, you're rolling the dice, obviously, with the development, because fundamentally we don't develop this way anymore with 15-foot storefronts. Like, it's just not very common, right? Because it's not, we're not focused on those kind of businesses usually when we're building buildings. So I think that's the big risk, more than the, as much as the architectural risk for me. But
well, there's also nothing though that would prevent. These are all in sole ownership. This building. These are just tenants. There's nothing to prevent the owner of the building from kicking the tenants out or putting in a dollar store, or So I wouldn't say that.
They at least have to get a certificate of appropriateness.
Yeah. Well, actually, what would keep them from doing that is we actually did pass in our omnibus zoning code in January some very strict rules about the scaling of storefronts.
Yeah.
So although I agree, the economics are different, and we're not going to get 12 or 13 front bays like you have in some of these places. No one's going to come in and build a 60-foot store because they wouldn't be allowed to.
Well, this ordinance doesn't let you close windows and doors without a certificate as well. So if you wanted to convert it all into one storefront, hopefully you'd be blocked by the zoning requirements for the storefront, and then also essentially an architectural requirement for review of the facade changes.
The real issue, though, is, we're trying to kind of game out a lot of things here, but the real question is really, because this is a historic district and a historic preservation ordinance, the discussion really just sort of has to be, are these buildings, because of their urban form or their architecture or the era they were built, the degree to which they've been altered, do they or don't they contribute to this narrative about Narberth? And it's, I find it myself tough to disentangle, the complex, the experience, the Alan Jacobs, so to speak, experience. And he was my advisor in graduate school, I'm happy to say. That kind of experience is not exactly what I think the preservation ordinance is designed to reflect. It's designed to that's sort of a outcome of the character, but not necessarily what the preservation ordinance can preserve. So I think it's really a matter of, are these buildings, are they really characteristic of that type of history that we've just voted on being part of the history of Narberth? Do they contribute to that history, or because of their form, architecture, are they not contributing to that? And I guess my own feeling is that long strip of buildings that we were just talking about don't, but the other buildings like the American Family Market really are connected to that narrative about Narberth, whatever their other urban qualities might be.
I might be able to simplify things for you a little if you turn back to the Essex grouping, because it looks like I spoke too soon about some of those buildings. So we know that the bank is 1926. We know that part of this appendage here is pre-1945, but it appears that this was not developed until after 45. Obviously, you're going to be making your decisions about this using more than just the date. But a visual examination, I think, could probably help confirm, some of the more documentary evidence that we have about those dates. But it looks like, yeah, if you can get a little bit closer, it looks like actually the piece where the ATM is post 1945. They did a good job.
What happened there? Before we try to settle this, I'm just curious, are there any other buildings that people would like to discuss, or is it mostly these buildings around Essex and Haverford?
You can actually even see that butt joint in the wall right here, where the ATM is, suggesting that the building is an addition. Right there. Yep.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So from the ATM past this is
Yeah.
numerically
Yeah, it looks like it.
later.
So from the ATM south, that's
North. Yeah, south, right.
Interesting.
Kathleen, can you bring up that photograph that you had sent to us on Friday? Is that possible?
Kathleen, I think you can probably share screen.
Yeah. I think to be an architectural historian, you really have to become an expert in the model years of cars.
So there you see the bank and the little, I guess that was the first addition to
The
bank.
first edition, yeah.
So I'd like to ask Kathleen and Chloe, if there's a building like this that has been added to repeatedly, and some of the additions are within the era of significance and some of the additions aren't, how is that viewed under the implementation of a preservation code? Are the different parts of the building treated? Could like part of a building be non-contributing and part of a building be contributing?
Kathleen, I'd love for you to answer this, but you're muted. So go, you go first, but unmute.
Good question.
Okay, thanks. I think that ordinarily you have to view the building as one property or one resource, and that you don't divide it up into different components based on sections that you think are contributing or non-contributing. But having said that, I think that there's probably room for discussion about this with our state consultant, because this is a local historic district. It's very different from a national historic district. And we've learned a lot, I think, in our conversations with Corey about how local historic districts are created, and regulations are really at the behest of the community. This is a borough decision about what it is that you want to preserve and not preserve. And so there could be room for discussion about how you would treat a resource that would seem to have very starkly different character defining features that have been either retained or covered up or.
I just want to point out, technically, that facade in that photo isn't even what the addition looks like now.
It's true.
That is a doorway and a storefront window, it looks like. And if you look at Street View, pardon?
It looks like it's set back a little even.
It might be, it's hard to tell because it's such a different color if the photo's been altered. But yeah, the current facade has a like colonial keystone window.
Sorry.
It's totally different. And which kind of gets to the whole point of like even there's a lot of 50s buildings with that sort of colonial aesthetic that was actually applied because it's the era of Ed Bacon and Independence Mall. I mean, it is a selective editing of architectural style in some ways to punch up the colonial, even post-war. So anyway, just a technical note. The wing is not the way it was in 1925 probably.
Well, I want to try and get to a resolution of this because it's getting late and it feels like these are the only buildings under discussion right now. And with that, we'll have the bulk of our work done for the evening. So I guess I'd like to just sort of take a straw poll. The first question is, how many planning commissioners would entertain designating some of these buildings as non-contributing versus how many planning commissioners would not entertain designating any of these buildings? I mean, is it even worth talking about some of these buildings being non-contributing, or is the preponderance of sentiment that they should all be contributing? So I guess the first, a show of hands, who would like to continue talking about whether some of these buildings at least should be considered non-contributing, and how many? Okay, so that's one. Okay, so I think I say 6 votes for considering some of these as being non-contributing. Okay, so that means we should continue discussing it. And I guess my next question is not so much a poll, but I guess what I'd like to look for now that we've seen these buildings and we've discussed them and learned about them and heard different opinions about them, what I'd like to do is make sure we can articulate a coherent criteria or reason why a building is considered to be contributing or non-contributing. I mean, I think we have a framework from our ordinance that we've recommended. We have a framework from what we've learned about the state law. But what would be the criteria we would use to look at these buildings and say, that's contributing or that's non-contributing? So I think one obviously is date. That's implicit so far. We've talked a bit about a criteria of whether or not a building is been so significantly altered that it doesn't really reflect that era of history in which it was originally built. And that is straight from our ordinance, with the counter argument that commercial areas are dynamic. So is that a criteria people can agree to, though, that some degree of alteration would be a criteria for using to determine whether or not a building is contributing or not?
Yes.
On that? Okay. So are there other criteria that anyone would like to propose, like that would help us determine whether or not a building should be considered contributing besides its degree of alteration? Or is that really it? I would add that is it possible to describe, even though the building might have been built during a certain date, is it more atypical than typical of what would have been characteristically built in the town up until that time? So for example, I say that because I think that one building I pointed out was somewhat atypical as to what would have been seen in Narberth to that time. It didn't really fit the pattern of how the commercial town was being build. It broke the pattern, at least to my view. And so I would argue that would be a reason for not including it, because it's not that its integrity has changed, it's that when it was built, it didn't really reflect the kind of narrative about town as the way that other buildings did, in terms of its scale in particular. I'd propose that as a criteria that could apply to the Citizens Bank building in terms of its scale and the way it, like, the side of the building faces the street. That's not really typical. Now the way it's designed, it's the side of the building, not entrances and fronts that face the street. But I'm just, is that something that people think could be a criteria?
I don't know. For me, we have such a small building stock. It's hard for me to start talking about, well, this building doesn't represent what was being done here because we have such a small sample. I mean, if whether it's the bank building or the family market, the old A&P, they represent those archetypes pretty well for what was being done at the time, for those uses. And so I for one, tend to fall back on the degree of alteration more than that.
Okay. Other thoughts about that? Sounds like the only criteria that's taking hold is a degree of alteration.
It's hard to know. When was the A&P built? My guess is the A&P got a new facade and that the building behind it has been there for quite a while.
Right.
You got that little characteristic pediment feature, which we all associate with A&Ps from coast to coast. Atlantic and Pacific, I mean. But apart from that, the structure itself is probably pretty old. It seems to me that the evolution of the commercial strip is totally continuous on both sides of the street.
You mean continuous architecturally or chronologically?
Chronologically.
Okay.
The development of the street is almost impossible to pin down. And it wouldn't matter if you did pin it down, because at any given moment in the history of Haverford Avenue, there's a pattern that everybody considers to be the pattern of Haverford Avenue. But
Can I share my screen?
sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
How do I do it? Oh, wait, okay, I got it.
Bottom, Heidi, where it says
Apparently you
source
can't
code.
share your screen.
There you go.
Hey. Cars are in the wrong direction.
I love this photo a lot.
It was two-way.
That's a great photograph.
But as you can see, that small row, that low row has always been there, at least since 1920.
Yeah,
There it is.
undeniable. Yeah.
Well, no, it's definitely physically there. What you can see is that the vernacular architecture of the period, it looks like it's a brick parapet, and then the defining characteristic is these canvas awnings over the sidewalk, and then looks like there's a bell tower on top of your two-story building.
I want to put that back.
It has a peaked roof.
Well, it was a firehouse originally.
Yeah, so it's totally the roof is totally different.
No. The hipped roof is still there.
Yeah, the roof's the same. It's just the tower.
The front pitch has changed.
Tower, right?
But the
The
hipped
tower,
roof
the tower changes it so much. Yeah.
Well, still, I would submit if alteration is criteria, that low-rise building certainly has been altered. Though who knows? I mean, maybe that brick coursework is right behind that metal facade.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, you might be exactly right.
Can anybody read the sign on the A&P?
Variety store.
Something variety store.
Narberth Variety Store.
Revert variety store. So it wasn't built as the A&P.
No, I have to eat my words, I think.
It's like a local Woolworth.
Yeah.
It's a 5 and dime, right?
It was the pre-Mapes.
And some of the original finishes may be covered up.
Right, that's correct. They may all be behind there.
Even on the one story. I mean, I've been listening, but I really feel like you don't single out something in the middle of a block to say it's non-contributing. I think you have to be careful because we don't know enough about this. And I think, you know, there could be stuff that's covered up. I mean, yes, there have been openings that have been enclosed and has taken away the integrity. But why wouldn't we want to look at any project that's proposed here before it's demolished?
That's a good point. That's a very good point. I mean, I'm looking at this thinking that there's probably a lot more surviving along here than I suspected.
If you go to the Narberth History, Friends of Narberth History website, there's a lot of views of old Narberth. And it's
not too many of the downtown though.
It's pretty interesting. Not too many, but a few. I mean, here's the YMCA building.
Yeah.
Right. Well, that's before the addition.
Yeah, that's before the addition.
But this building's still here.
Well, I guess I have to ask Kathleen or Chloe for a little advice here. I'm sensing that at the moment we don't have enough of information to make a coherent argument as to why any of the buildings that we've been discussing should be considered non-contributing if they were built before 1945. We just don't know enough about what's behind them, or there's.
I think this has been a really useful conversation, and I agree with Heidi, and I think Dave, who concurred, that a lot of those defining features are what you would consider to be contributing to the 1920s streetscape of Narberth could just be behind poor modifications, you know.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So I would feel comfortable, you know, I guess as the historian in the group, dismissing these without more investigation.
Well, and yet, can I make a comment? And yet, it's kind of ironic that if we continue to designate these as contributing, we will essentially be protecting them as they are and asking that their facades not be altered.
No, that's not true. It just goes in front for review.
But but we have language that parts of these buildings get replaced in kind, you know, and in look. So how does that, you know, how would we address uncovering previous features of the building that we might be valuing about them?
It doesn't require replacement in kind. It doesn't have to be reviewed if it's being replaced in kind. If they want to do something else.
So what's the value of the protection on them if they're contributing, if they're deemed contributing?
The
protection would be against demolition
primarily.
Right. Yeah.
And removing major elements. Like if that bell tower was still there, you wouldn't be able to remove it.
Yeah, but on
You couldn't flatten a hipped roof and
I
replace it.
understand, but the buildings that we've just been looking at, the one-story buildings and then those on Essex, they essentially have entirely new facades and openings on
Right.
them. There's nothing that I can see that's visible that's left to preserve, and the ordinance asks that the that the existing facades be preserved.
I would take issue with that because I think the intent of the ordinance is to protect the character of the building that contributes to what you think is significant about the district. So removing the facades that were put in, in the 60s or 70s reveals what's underneath them. The entrances, some of those picture windows certainly are not 1920s, but the entrances, there's still a footprint there for the original entrance. And, it's, if you walk down Lancaster Avenue, some of the recent renovations that have occurred to buildings that you'd think were, ought to have been non-contributing, it's really significant and has really enhanced the streetscape because little did we know there was a lot that was left underneath it, and had those buildings not been in the historic district and had they been considered non-contributing, it would have been too late. We wouldn't have known it, and they would have been demolished. So I would say, at least give these the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah.
But also, I would say, Jim, you've got to read what the ordinance covers. It doesn't cover altering a facade. It covers removing things. It covers changing a footprint, changing height, changing a building volume by removing towers, turrets, or spires, changing the slopes of roofs, concealing decorative or cornice roof or cornice treatments. So like if you reveal a decorative treatment, that's actually okay. Removing porches, removing porch roofs, removing columns, removing railings, removing or concealing windows. I don't think that is something we would want to see on Haverford Avenue. Removing or concealing doors. I mean, those are the things that are regulated. It's not changing your facade or changing your sign or changing the material on your facade. That's not regulated. The code is really focusing on the removal of things. The real rub would be if there was a development plan that wanted to contemplate the replacement of some of those buildings. That's where the friction would come. I can't see that this is going to constrain a building owner from from redesigning their facade, or unless they want to conceal their decorative roof line, like on the north side of Haverford Avenue, which I think that's probably something we'd agree ought to be reviewed. So I'm not sure it will be a huge constraint. What I was going to suggest is that we don't have enough information tonight to make a reasonable and well-articulated decision as to what buildings might be contributing or non-contributing. So for the time being, they all ought to be considered contributing, but that we might put it on the agenda to take a closer look at the downtown area of the historic district to see if we can, at some point, articulate better what should be contributing or non-contributing. It's always easier to remove a building than to add a building in. The other thing is any property owner is allowed to contest whether or not their building is contributing or non-contributing. And so if a property owner of one of these buildings felt that their designation was unreasonable, they could provide the evidence as to why that building should be non-contributing, as opposed to us doing all that work. It's a little onerous, but since I don't think we have a better path tonight, that's all I can suggest, is that we consider the buildings contributing now, recognize that further work has to be done, acknowledge there's an escape valve for owners, and see if the question could be revisited when we can generate more information.
Sounds good to me, Todd.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Any objection to that? I mean, I don't see how we can get any other outcome tonight.
Has been a very interesting discussion.
Yeah, I mean, it just shows the limits of what we know, and that's important to recognize.
I hate finding out how little I know.
I'm reminded all the time. So is that an acceptable, Adam, you brought up some of these buildings. Is that acceptable to you? Dave?
I'm convinced.
Okay, Dave, how about you? Is that acceptable to you? Okay. So with that, we will then, and then I think there might be a few little errors that we have to clean up in these maps. I was noticing.
I assure you that there are some errors.
Yeah, so I think we should continue to kind of clean up and double check the maps and use the maps to indicate, to make them as correct as possible in terms of the dates of the buildings which are considered non-contributing. The last thing, Dave, is which buildings did you map as non-contributing because of their alteration?
Okay, there were. I don't have the addresses. One is, I wonder if we can get street view and we can look at them. The one was the old Giuliani's restaurant on the corner of Woodbine and I guess that's Iona. The
Northeast corner.
Northeast corner.
Okay.
And the other is the house under construction at the moment on Dudley. I think is it Conway or Dudley? I guess
it's Dudley, just north of Sabine.
Yeah, yeah. It's just I guess the second or third house up from Sabine on the west side of the street.
Because it has been altered so drastically through its new addition and construction.
Right.
Does anyone does anyone have questions about those buildings or object to considering them non-contributing because of the degree of alterations?
I fully agree with Dave on that.
Any questions about those buildings or any disagreement about considering those non-contributing? Were those the only two, Dave?
Yes, those are the only two that I marked on the plans.
Okay, I don't hear any objections, so we'll include those on the map. Okay, so I think what I'd like to do is to just vote to ask for vote to submit this map to council as assuming that that it reflects all buildings built after 1945 as non-contributing, with the two buildings Dave referenced as considered non-contributing, and with the note that we need to do further work to consider whether there are specific properties downtown that might be considered non-contributing. We're not able to make that determination at this point, recognizing that property owners can provide that evidence if they'd like, and that we can continue that work.
What will happen if we find errors on this map after we vote on it? Can we still make corrections to it?
Yeah, I think what we'll do is we'll vote. What I'd like to do is propose what I hope someone will make is a recommendation that that the map reflect all buildings built up until 1945 as being contributing, except for the two buildings that Dave mentioned. And so the graphic map is illustrative, and if we have to keep fixing it because we find something here or there, I think that the trick is what record is used to determine that. The county's records aren't entirely accurate, apparently. But I think if the language is that, then that becomes the governing principles, that it's a building that was built up until 1945, and that the map is illustrative and it reflects to our best knowledge what those buildings are.
So what council needs to vote on is the district boundary.
Mm-hmm.
And then for PHMC, we actually have to submit a list going building by building, including any outbuildings visible from the public way, and indicate whether they're contributing or non-contributing.
Actually, Chloe, that reminded me actually, and I wanted to mention, because I thought a lot about two issues as I walked around. One is there are a number of garages that are in the first lot layer, a few of which are architecturally pretty distinguished. And I didn't know if there was a way to have them as protected as the main building on the lot. And the second was, do we have to have any kind of consideration made the buildings that are in the second and third lot layers, or do those necessarily just are not relevant to the discussion?
I asked Corey that second. So the first question, the PHMC asks that every structure that's within the district boundaries, we use the word building because
Every building.
Kathleen pointed out that PHMC has a different definition of structure than I do in my brain. Every building that's within the district boundaries be enumerated in a list, including outbuildings, and they're each their own thing. It doesn't matter whether they're on the same parcel as another building or not. Like each is considered on its own. So if a garage or other accessory building is on the property and within the district and meets the criteria, then it would be considered contributing and subject to review, just like any other type of building. But I asked Corey the specific question about, well, the way that Narberth has written the ordinance is that it has to be visible from anything that gets reviewed, has to be both visible from the public way and within either the first or second lot layer. And if there are outbuildings that don't meet those criteria, do they need to be on this enumerated list for PHMC? And he said no. So we can just ignore like backyard garages that are not within the public way and visible from the public way and within the first and second lot layer.
Okay.
Okay. So would someone care to make a motion that we can vote on in regard to the boundaries of the district and the buildings that we wish to consider non-contributing at this point? Sit here. This is the last thing we have to do tonight.
I would do it, but I'm brain dead.
All right, I'll make a motion. I will make a motion that we recommend the council the map that Dave has provided that indicates the boundaries of the district based on the district being defined as a period of significance up to 1945, that the district include all structures visible from the street and in the first or second lot layer, except for the two buildings structures that Dave has indicated, and that the map of contributing and non-contributing buildings is, in terms of their date, is illustrative, while we confirm the actual building dates of construction for the buildings or for the structures in the district. And that we will, furthermore, that we will revisit the criteria for evaluating buildings downtown at a later date when we have more information about their date of construction, degree of alteration. How's that sound? Do I have a second for that?
I'd like to second that. That sounds excellent.
Okay.
Yes.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Heidi's opposed. Okay, so it carries by 6-1. Okay. So the last item of business we have is to schedule our special meeting, but I'm not going to put us through the pain of that. Jim Spear has circulated a doodle poll, which has been sent to you once or twice already. And so please respond to that doodle poll about your availability for a special meeting towards the end of the month to do probably a development review of 3 Elmwood and 32 Dudley. That's what will be on our agenda. All right. And then finally, is there any public comment on any other topic tonight from anyone who is still with us? Hearing no public comment, I will ask for a motion to adjourn. Come on.
So moved.
Okay, second.
Second.
Dave saying all in favor of adjourning?
Aye.
Thank you all very much. We'll see you later this month.
Yeah.
And we'll be in touch with about follow-up steps as well.
And thank you, Chloe and Kathleen.
Yes, thank you all very, very much.
Invaluable.
Dave and Heidi for all of their work on this as well.
Yes, it's been a Herculean effort. And everyone I talked to in council is deeply, deeply appreciative of the effort everyone is making to pull this along. So thank you. Okay, good night, everyone. Drive
Good
safely.
Good night.
Good night.